Hi everyone, I'm Joshua Carl Riantapatra from the ad for NSDC 2020, or Kai Riantapatra, you can call me whatever. And here's the post-debate analysis for round four. We're going to be talking about some of the ideas that the Edge Core thought would make for a good discussion within this motion. So to remind everyone, the motion was, as a young parent, this house would implement tough love. And the context slide was tough love is a parenting ideology where parents hold back from indulging their kids, for example, giving gifts and constant expressions of affection, choosing to enforce a strict discipline instead, for example, limiting expressions and imposing rules. Now, before we go into what kinds of arguments and contentions could be brought in this debate, um, we can start with like the background for why this motion was established to begin with. So what's with this motion? If we look at the parenting strategies and ideologies that have been employed for the past several generations, starting from Generation X, for the most part, they were raised with tough love. And not only with tough love, but tough love that incorporated corporal punishment. That is like physically beating your children. That only started to get banned around the 1980s. That's when it started gaining traction. So yeah, that Gen X was raised with a lot of tough love. And the next generation, the millennials, were raised with the opposite of tough love, right? There's also participation awards. They're told that they're special. So you have these two diametrically opposing ideologies and views of how you want to raise a child. Both have their positives, both have their negatives. Some say that Generation X was traumatized by corporal punishment. Some say that millennials are now lazy and entitled because they were raised with too many participation awards. So the question then comes, given the trajectory of history, previously tough love was the trend, then the opposite of tough love was the trend. Now, as young parents, how should we raise the new generation, which are the Gen Z and the Gen Alpha? So this is like quite directly related to Hegel's philosophy, where he argues that history swings like a pendulum. You always start on one side of the spectrum, one extreme, and as time progresses, you swing to the other side of the other side of the spectrum, and you go back and forth from there in an attempt to find balance. That was Hegel's idea on how history operated. So two things to keep in mind when you're going through this debate as to avoid making mistakes in the way you frame your arguments. First is that tough love is not the same as conservatism. We would probably be inclined to believe that, okay, that if you implement tough love, you're probably going to do things like force your child to be part of a certain religion, certain religious practices, to not express love to certain genders, for example, to confine to gender roles. Those are all examples of conservatism, not specifically of tough love. Remember, the important characteristic of tough love is that they let their children go through hardship, or sometimes impose hardships onto their children for the purpose of attempting to better the lives of their children. Whether or not it works remains to be seen, which is why we have a debate. And the second thing to keep in mind is, like, don't be too crazy to try and push burdens onto either side of the house. So as proposition, you probably want to go against saying, okay, there's going to be absolutely no discipline on opposition side of the house. These parents are going to fully succumb to every single desire of their kids. Conversely, as opposition, I would refrain from saying, oh, proposition is going to kick their kids out of their house, is going to force their kids to live in the street, because that's what tough love looks like. Just generally, avoid trying to do these crazy burden pushes, because it makes the debate a lot less engaging and a lot less reflective of reality. Because in reality, you have a much it operates on a spectrum, and very rarely do you have that extremely soft version of parenting, or very rarely do you have that extremely hard parenting either. It operates more closer on the spectrum. So let's look at the contentions. We found that mainly there were two aspects that could be delved into deeper in discussing this motion. The first would be the success of the children, like how do you better their lives? And the second would be the relationship between parents and kids. So first on success. And before we talk about the various arguments that can be brought in terms of success, I think it's worth noting that success can have many definitions. So you want to keep that in mind too as you're making these arguments. Success doesn't only have to mean making more money in a high corporate job. It could be being fulfilled with your life. It could be finding a low wage job, but that matches your particular niche interests or something like that. So it would be a good idea probably to spend a couple of minutes thinking about what you mean when you say success. Like, what does success mean in your arguments? So I thought there were three arguments that could be brought on either side. First, uh, and this is proposition is on the left, opposition is on the right. Okay. So first, let's talk about impacts of freedom of choice. Proposition can argue that parents are better at picking what activities to devote their children should devote time to, right? Tell their children to invest time into activities that are more likely to yield returns, right? So given the fact that tough love has the characteristic of like forcing your children to do things that they might not want to do, this might be one of those benefits, right? You can force them to take extracurriculars that provide good certificates, for example. So you make a good choice on behalf of your children. But second, it's possible for parents to force commitment. Like, it's possible for parents to say, okay, you have to continually practice basketball from when you first get into primary school to when you graduate high school or when you graduate uni. And given the fact that parents are able to enforce this level of commitment, it's more likely that these children are able to develop a larger amount of skills which they can use later on in their life, in order to, skills to get jobs, skills to become successful. And again, what do you mean by when you say successful? On the converse, opposition can argue that it's better when these children are given free choice, right? Because when parents are less strict, these kids are going to be more flexible. They're going to branch out and try a variety of different activities. And what you can argue from that is that through trying lots of activities, they can find what best suits their particular skill sets. And you can argue the fact that they like what they're choosing to do is more likely to yield positive returns on the investment that they give, right? So that's like one general argument. What's the impact of free choice to both proposition or opposition side of the house? Now let's go through some other ideas proposition could bring. Second thing that could probably be brought is you could bring a problem-based learning approach to parenting. Now, what that means is that these kids are going to face problems as a result of just typical life. They go to school, they interact with friends, and they run into a bunch of problems. Or you can even argue that parents could artificially manufacture problems for their children to go through, right? Like putting their children into situations where they have lots of deadlines they have to meet, or putting children into certain circumstances which requires them to go through problems. And what you can argue is that by leaving these children in these difficult situations alone, these children are forced to learn a new skill. The problem becomes an avenue for them to increase their skills. So for example, if a parent imposing tough love was to put their child into multiple extracurriculars and say that they have to do well in all of them, otherwise and they would be punished if they don't do well, then that child is quite simply forced to stretch the limits of their capabilities and become better at performing in these extracurriculars. Now the second argument that can be brought, so that's an argument to say that the trials that they go through produce specific skills. The third argument that could be brought in terms of increasing like success and capabilities of these children is that that tough love can produce a solution-oriented attitude. Now, what we mean by this is because they're continuously forced to face problems on on their own by themselves, they build a habit of when a problem approaches them, their habit is to find a way to fix that problem instead of deferring to their parents, instead of asking for their parents' advice, asking for their parents to make a decision for them, or those kinds of things. So because you're forcing these kids to go through hardship, they develop a degree of individual like self-control and that sort of thing. So what do we think opposition can bring? I think there are two additional arguments in addition to the one that I said at the beginning. First is that you can say that by not using tough love, you can create a comfortable environment to grow for these children. You can note that you can build the self-confidence of these children by affirming them, giving them praise, giving them affection, and you can nurture them. And in this environment where they're comfortable, that's what gives them the courage to take action, right? So they take hold of their own lives, and that's when they have an internal motivation to seek out opportunities, to seek out a desire to increase their own skills. So instead of it being a externally motivated thing, instead of being forced to do things by your parents, you use a more internally motivated thing, an internally motivated system where from your own personal confidence, your own personal desire to grow, you take action, join extracurricular activities, push yourself to become better. Now, the last argument that could be brought in terms of opposition under this contention is talking about positive reinforcement strategy. And what that means basically is that when you praise a kid when they do a good job, even if they didn't do a great job. So for example, let's say they gave a speech in debate and they made 4 mistakes and they did 1 thing right. Instead of talking about the 4 things that they did wrong, someone who's not using a tough love strategy might opt for simply highlighting the 1 thing that they did right. Now, what that does is that sends a signal to that child that this 1 thing that you did right, that was good. So repeat more of this specific type of behavior and less of the other types of behaviors. Now, I think this is quite similar to like Pavlovian argument where this person, so the child will associate positive feelings with and like the feeling of praise and the feeling of like affection. They're going to associate that with good behavior, right? So when they study long and you praise them for that, when they get a good score and you praise them for that, they're going to get that association that these activities are beneficial and they should continue to do more of them. So that's for how you could argue success for both prop or op, and how that produces individuals who are more likely to be of higher skill than the other side of the house. And for the second contention is filial relationships. Now, filial is just another way of saying parent-child relationship. This is quite a smaller contention. I think it's probably a good idea for extension, second speaker substantive, but it doesn't have to be. This is just some ideas that we thought of. So I'm gonna start from op this time. I think op's arguments are much more intuitive in the sense that it's easy to argue that the relationship between the parent and child will be a lot closer in the moment that you're constantly showing physical affection, doing things like family bonding, even just saying you love them. Because even if it's true that like tough love is love, it's a lot harder for children to understand that, because what they feel is like they feel the brunt, the pain of it first. So simply because kids are more likely to understand the loves that their parents show them through physical affection, saying you love them, they're able to develop a closer bond. And you can extend this by saying that this is like incredibly important in like teenager ages, because of like the lack of self-confidence that a lot of teenagers have, and because of their necessity to want to please people. Like you're by providing love to them in this mechanism, you create a solid foundation for a good connection. But so that's all. Prop also has a good argument to make for filial relationships though. Now, what's important to note here is that you'd probably want to start with this piece of framing. A good relationship does not necessarily mean a close relationship. You do not need to be infinitely close with your parents for it to be a good, healthy, loving relationship. And the assertion that you could probably use to support this claim is you could say that under proposition side of the house, you decentralize the need for validation, right? Exactly. You can say that because they don't receive validation from their parents, they aren't reliant on validation from their parents. They're not continuously trying to please their parents. Rather, they learn to find their own satisfaction that's detached from their parents, right? So they don't have to, exactly because they're not receiving physical affection. Exactly. That sounds a bit harsh, but exactly because they're not continually being bombarded by physical affection, they don't develop that dependency physical affection and family bonding. Therefore, you can argue that that produces a more sustainable relationship model, i.e., kids are not always trying to please their parents in every aspect of their life, and they're able to come to terms with the fact that parents and kids don't have to agree 100% on every single topic, and it's okay to not continuously be receiving praise and affection from your parents. You can argue that that's a more healthy relationship model because that reduces the reliance on children with parents, and that just means that later on in life, they're more able to become their own person. Like when they move out of the house, for example, they don't experience anxiety because they're relying on their parents. If when their parents die when they're like 40 50 years, when the child is 40 50 years old, they're not incredibly hampered by the lack of connection with their parents because their parents are gone. So that's the conclusion really of the two contentions that we thought were the most important in this debate. First being success, and how do you produce kids that are high skilled, have good mindsets, that's that sort of idea. And how do you produce a relationship between parents and kids that's sustainable and beneficial for both parties. Feel free to leave comments in the YouTube section if you have anything. We'll try to answer them, but we can't promise that we'll be able to answer all the questions. And good luck for the future rounds.